Human rights should be self-evident. There really shouldn't be a need for any kind of discussion as to whether human beings should have rights by nature for what they are, for who they are, human beings. But what about animal rights? Animals, we think, also have rights. They should not be abused. Any use of animals has to be justified, and it should be in accordance with their nature, with their being. But what about nature? Does nature have rights? Can we truly speak of natural rights for human beings, for animals, for creatures in general? This is the question that I think is so very fascinating, and I wanted to investigate it in this paper. Alistair McIntyre is one person who seems to have given up on rights, and he writes in After Virtue, "The truth is plain. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns." So that's a very radical dismissal of what would seem to be one of the 20th century's most significant accomplishments, the International Declaration of Human Rights, which is so important to protect us in this modern age. But Alistair McIntyre sees the problem of the modern age differently. He draws attention to a development in the understanding of nature that draws our attention away from the inherent purposes in creatures, in being, and directed behavior, goals, teleology. And by losing all of that, he argues, we really have lost our foundation in the philosophical tradition, and therefore we end up in this very difficult situation of, at the same time, believing in human rights, advocating human rights, but not being really able to speak of the reality of human rights. And Leo Strauss thinks similarly, earlier, of course, even than Alistair McIntyre, and he drew attention to the fundamental dilemma, which is the victory of the modern natural science. It really changed our understanding of nature because the success of natural science is so significant that really nobody can ignore it. And for us to understand rights requires us to think about natural science and how to draw it into this discussion. But how do we do this? And I found a very significant way of doing it, but when I discovered the work by Edith Stein and her masterpiece, Finite and Eternal Being. And she's a phenomenologist. She was trained by Edmund Husserl and worked with them for many years and discovered her philosophical foundation in Husserl's phenomenology. And she applied that in ways to understand human being, the characteristic of empathy, for example, how to understand another person. And her work is so very significant because late in her life, after she had become a Carmelite sister, she wrote her masterpiece, Finite and Eternal Being. And there she draws together the classical Aristotelian philosophy with its medieval Christian interpretation in the work of Thomas Aquinas, but also Duns Scotus, the Franciscan tradition. And she wants to show us that our experiences have to be part and cannot be replaced with the entire abstraction that might happen in a modern natural science view of nature. We have to be honest and be grounded in this immediate way of knowing that she explores in phenomenology. How can our various ways of knowing be brought together? So we'll start with modern scientific understanding of nature. And I want to show you how it misleads us by concealing the reality of individual being and thereby its rights. Then the question is, well, if not by modern science, then how do we grasp individual being and particularly living being and the being of an I, the first person perspective, the I that knows a you, that is known by a you? And how can we understand this in the philosophy of Edith Stein? And this will ground us then to really grasp the understanding of being and living being. And we'll discover in part 3 how living beings are found in relationships of care, of mutual dependency, and the specific nature of personal being in this context of call to care is that personal being is aware of the call to care, is indeed called to care in a very specific way of knowing about being and understanding this call to care and choosing it. Now, the fourth part then goes to the foundations of metaphysics, Aristotelian metaphysics of substance, matter, and form. And I want to show you how valuable those concepts remain and how we can integrate mathematical physics and modern science into this picture by applying mathematical physics as an understanding of prime matter in the Aristotelian context of matter, form, and substances made out of both. And on this foundation, we can then really come to rights, and we can ask about rights in relationship to our understanding of being and the being of others, and how our understanding of nature in all its forms, in the scientific form and in the more intuitive form and in the experiential form, and how all of these different forms of knowing can inform us about the nature of these rights, and then properly understand the differences between human rights and animal rights, and even how rights need to be applied to specific creatures, individual beings, and in their specific individuality. So all of this together can be summed up in my understanding of leather ethics as emphasizing the minority of individual being and rights related to imperfection and insufficiency. So not so much about power, rights giving you power to act as you please, but rights that relate to imperfection and insufficiency, so that rights can be applied in the proper order between powers and needs in individual beings. We do not have time here to really go into the philosophy of science at sufficient depth, but it comes down to the question about what you believe in the scientifically understood world. Do atoms exist? Do elementary particles exist? And what about living creatures? Do they exist? And the problem is that elementary particles really exist in their own mathematical theories, and you cannot supplement the theories with concepts like individual being, living being, or personal being. There simply is no room in the theories for that. And a physical description of something tends to really end up either being holistic, everything is one thing, or it becomes reduced to the elementary particles at the very beginning. But the in-between structures, like emergent features, you really cannot fit those into a metaphysical understanding of nature that believes in the reality of elementary particles. So that's just a conflict that you will not be able to resolve. And even basic concepts like time, they become consequences of higher timeless theories. But what even is that related to being? And you have well-known problems in relativity and quantum mechanics, which simply tell you that it cannot be like the theories describe the world. They disagree with each other and basic logic in quantum mechanics. So you have to realize there's a problem, but you cannot dismiss science. I mean, it can't be wrong because it predicts observations with near perfect accuracy. You have to deal with that. You can't ignore that. So all we can do here for now is to acknowledge the problem, but we put it aside and we're going to come back to it later, because first we need to know what do we mean by being, individual being, being in time, living being, and person. The way we know being, the way we can even start to talk about being, is that we know it as our own being. The characteristic about being a human being is that we can ask this question, who am I? And what does it mean to be? And we are aware through this, firstly, through our own being. So we have to really begin there. And we have to begin with experience of being a fleeting experience between past and future. We cannot hold on to it. We are contingent. We do not have to be. We just happen to be. And we can imagine the possibility of eternity, being forever, but also the being of the not being, the nothingness, and indeed, in some way, we're passing into nothingness. And the true philosophers who really emphasize these distinctions are Edith Stein, who is the one that we'll be following mostly here, but also Martin Heidegger and his philosophy, which is an interesting alternative. But of course, Edith Stein's philosophy makes a whole lot more sense to me. Now, Stein speaks of being carried in existence. So yes, we are contingent, but the fact of our being suggests being carried in existence, being held in existence, Whereas Heidegger uses the word being thrown into existence, and that already is an interesting juxtaposition. Stein, of course, is open to faith, whereas Heidegger is not, at least not in the sense of faith as Catholics would understand it. But they both provide a philosophical foundation for being, for living being, and the I, the first person singular, who is the person aware of being gifted with being. And what makes Stein so significant is that she now takes the philosophy and places it in the context of Aquinas and also Duns Scotus, because of the significance of individuality in Scotus's philosophy. And this lets her now explore the openness of being to other creatures. Our own being, yes, but also the being of animals, the being of non-living creatures. And in this way, we can continue her philosophy in a way that goes to our relationship with all creation. And this also lets us look at philosophy, the moral philosophy, and how we are supposed to interact with each other and with other creatures. In Heidegger's case, Dasein, the being of the human being, remains his principal concept of being. He can't really move much beyond that. And this makes his program much less interesting for my own program right here. Now, to make further progress, we have to go from being to caring and to rights from there. And in order to truly understand the concept of care in relationship to being, we have to first look at animals, at living beings, because this is where we see a being caring about itself, basically. But of course, living beings are not only recognizable as living beings by their centrality, by their ability to sustain themselves, they're also something like care that we immediately recognize in an animal caring for offspring, for example. But is that instinct or is it by understanding? And if care by understanding is something different, then why do we have that? Why do we understand care? And of course, it begins with the way we come ourselves to the awareness of our own being. We awaken to our own self. Our own self-awareness is not some abstract process in some kind of Cartesian reflection, but we awake to our own being through the receiving of care from caregivers, children from their mothers, from their fathers, from other caregivers. They build relationships in early infancy, and in these relationships of caring, of dependency, they awaken to being and develop an awareness of the understanding of being and the fundamental nature of care in understanding being. And in this process, our ability to have empathy, to consider ourselves from the perspective of somebody else, to take another person's perspective, or even an animal's perspective of the world. A child will do that very easily. And in this way, placing us in the place of another, which is what empathy is about, we really are able to understand being and care together. And the understanding of reality is not the scientific understanding and by abstraction, which is morally indifferent. The true understanding of reality, the acknowledgement of another being, is an ethical act. To say, yes, you are real, is an act of ethics as well as ontology. So understanding reality is not a morally neutral thing. Understanding reality like reality really is requires us to be open to the concept of care and to make an act of recognition of not just being, but also the rights, because this is what care is directed to. So in this way, in the philosophy of Edith Stein and also in others like her, for example, Robert Spearman, we find that the acknowledgement of being grounds both ontology and ethics. They both emerge from the same beginning. I had promised you that I would return to modern science, and now I can. We can continue with the basic Aristotelian understanding of the individual being made up out of matter and form. And Aristotelian forms continue to be a very valid and important concept to understand reality. But if you study, for example, the use of Aristotelian forms in Edith Stein's work, then you can accommodate for the significance of individuation of forms, not unlike Duns Scotus's work, and also to acknowledge that forms in the history of life are changing structures and they're related to each other. So not as clearly distinct as they were in Aristotle's work. But the big difference today is that what Aristotle called prime matter, the abstraction, the material abstraction from real being, is now understandable. What mathematical physics speaks about is basically prime matters and a lawfulness inherent in prime matter. And with this combined understanding of matter through physics and physical science, and the human understanding of forms, intellectual understanding of Aristotelian forms, we can now actually understand not just species, but we can also understand differences between species and difference between individuals without simply using form as an ideal. So we can really understand the multiplicity of individual forms, not simply one ideal essence. It becomes much more easier now to deal with diversity, with individuality, and also with relationship between different species. And what is most significant from the physical perspective regarding form is that it has a power, but the power is not a physical power, material power, but the power is to elicit the moral response. The moral response toward living being. Modern science is indeed morally neutral. It is abstracted from real being and therefore ethically neutral, but our response to real beings is ethically informed. And in this way, we can do this. This now finally takes me to rights and real rights, rights based in reality. And what sets the human being apart is the specific distinctive nature of our understanding of being, the I-thou relationship, the being of another, and the ethical nature of care. Human beings understand that. And this makes human beings bearers of an implied promise. We are kind of sent into the world, we are sent forth, promittere, in order to really be this the personal presence of care towards creatures, towards creation, towards each other. And in this way, a human being has this promise, and it must not be taken away from a human being, because even if this promise is not powerful, not present yet, the mere fact that it is a human being implies this promise. So this is why the right not to be killed is indeed a fundamental human right that grounds all other rights. Now, animal rights are now related. They also derive from being, but an animal doesn't have the awareness of an ethical responsibility. An animal is not an implied promise for ethical care. An animal can instinctively care and can be trained to care for us, but they do not have an inherent obligation to care in the same way as a human being has that. In this way, an animal right does not have to be extended to imply the rights of existence, of continued existence, only not to be abused and not to be treated against their nature. So this really sums it now up. We have been able to really ground our understanding of rights in a deep ontological understanding of reality, of individual being, of living being, of human being. And we also have learned that we can take account of difference between individuals and difference between species and see commonality and difference. So we are still grounded in the traditional Aristotelian scheme of understanding nature, but now we have the power to also draw on modern sciences, modern philosophy, and get a much deeper understanding, especially when it comes to questions of diversity and individuality. We can now simply understand differences as individuals for who they are. And we no longer need to simply ask, what is the ideal and how close do we get to it?